Every game has a story. Only one is a legend. The legend is back.
It's hard to think of a time when The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker was seen as anything but an instant classic, but it was quite the controversial title when it came out. The gaming market in the West was just about entering puberty around this time, and gamers wanted games that were grown up and mature, like Halo or the Grand Theft Auto games. Nintendo's last few 3D Zelda games, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, both set a very grimdark direction for the series, and they had just released a tech demo to show the power of the GameCube, featuring Ganon and Link battling in a cathedral face-to-face, with some, well, decently impressive artwork. So when E3 2001 rolled around, Nintendo announced their big GameCube lineup. Pikmin, not a great look. Super Mario Sunshine, geez, what a colorful title. And then, here's the new Zelda game that the team had been working on. Yeah, as you can expect, the internet reacted. The game quickly got the nickname Zelda on the GameFAQs and IGN boards, and it was seen as a kiddie Zelda meant for 5-year-olds. 20 years later, and we're all a bit more grown up, well, at least I think I am. The lush illustrative style, large expansive sea, and the strong focus on the joy of discovery and exploration makes this one of my favorite Zelda games, and it's pretty highly rated among fans as well. Now, plenty of games have attempted to copy what made it so unique, but, and maybe this is just me, while quite a lot try, very few succeed. The shadows aren't vibrant enough, or the highlights are too bright, it just looks off. The cell shading in Wind Waker is quite detailed and involved, and there's a lot of tricks to get it tuned exactly how the team wanted it. So today, we'll be diving into Wind Waker's cell shading and figuring out how this game was able to do such a vibrant style so perfectly. And maybe we'll even learn some 3D graphics along the way. Sounds fun? Let's go. Now, before we begin, I want to take a minute to emphasize that lighting in video games is actually really complicated, and it's something that's only gotten more complicated over the last 20 years. So today, we'll have to focus on just the basics. Thankfully, Wind Waker is a great place to start, as the developers have built everything from extremely basic techniques. To give one example, most objects in Wind Waker are programmed only to ever respect a single light at a time. Even though Link is in the middle of the two torches here, the only light on Link's face is from the torch that he's slightly closer to, the one on the right. Walking to the left shows that it actually plays a little animation switching the light over. Now, the GameCube hardware that Wind Waker runs on could have supported up to 8 different lights, so they actually didn't have to do this, which suggests that this wasn't so much a hardware limitation as an art style decision by the developers. Keeping the lighting simple like this is a great way to make it more readable to the eye. With only one light, there's one area that's in highlight and one area that's in shadow, keeping the character silhouette crisp. This, by the way, is merely one small example of the incredibly meticulous planning that was crucial to make this game pop. There are a lot of different techniques used in the Wind Waker, all falling under the general umbrella of cell shading, but the specific one we'll be looking at today is the shading used on all the characters in the game. Every character follows a basic formula made up of about 3 parts. Vertex lighting, a very old school lighting technique common to 2001, followed by a step I call tunification, which takes the vertex lighting from before and gives it a distinctive cell shaded edge. And the final step is to tint the highlights and the shadows to the color palette of the scene, which helps it fit in with everything else around it. These 3 things might not sound too fancy on their own, but each one was quite the unique and novel concept in 2001. For instance, while the first step, vertex lighting, was somewhat possible on Nintendo's previous console, the Nintendo 64, neither tunification nor color paletization could have been accomplished on the hardware at the time. The PlayStation 2, while incredibly powerful on its own merits, also couldn't support these latter 2 steps, so the developers for these systems had to use radically different approaches to achieve cartoon styles. Going back to Wind Waker, the process starts with vertex lighting, so let's take some time to discuss both vertexes and lighting. As I'm sure you know, the 3D models in video games are made up of lots of tiny little triangles all connected to each other in a giant mesh. The individual points on these triangles are called vertexes, or vertices, and each one has quite a bit of information contained along with it. The most obvious piece of data in a vertex is the vertex's position, but there's also data like texture coordinates, which contain the details of how textures are cut up and arranged to fit different triangles, or things like additional color information, which games can use for all sorts of fun purposes, but most commonly to add extra tinting to a model without requiring extra textures. Finally, there is a curious thing known as the vertex normal. The vertex normal effectively determines which way the vertex faces, which, believe it or not, we actually can't tell just from the vertex's position alone. The vertex normal is a key requirement in determining vertex lighting, as a vertex is only considered lit when its normal faces the light. Here, the light that we have is coming from the sun, which is casting light rays down from the top right of the screen. So, only the vertices with normals even remotely facing the top right are going to get any light at all. How much light they receive is determined by how much these two face each other. Vertexes with normals pointed directly at the sun will receive the most light, and as the angle between them increases, the amount of light decreases. Now, this technique works pretty well when we're in direct sunlight, but what would happen if we were to move somewhere where we can't see the sun? Like under the roof outside Link's house. Going into first-person mode verifies that we can't see the sun from here, and yet Link's face is as bright as ever. In fact, the pots directly next to the wall seem to be getting incredibly strong highlights, despite there being no way that the sun's light is actually reaching it. The reason this happens is, of course, because the only thing we're actually doing is checking the angles. The parts of this pot that are lit up have their vertex normals pointed towards where the sun is, but that doesn't tell us about whether there's a whole house in between it. This is partially a hardware limitation. The technique that we would use to solve this problem today would have not been realistically possible on the GameCube hardware at the time. But it's not like they weren't thinking about problems like this. One of the most subtle effects in the game happens when you stare at the sun in first-person mode. A sharp lens flare comes into view, but when a piece of geometry or even just a cloud blocks out the sun, the lens flare goes away. In some sense, this is a very similar problem, trying to block light from the sun that we can't see. So the developers must have at least been aware of this inconsistency. But let's be clear here, this is the Wind Waker, and realism isn't necessarily the goal. Part of deciding what an art style is figuring out which parts of realism to keep and which parts to simplify or even outright ignore altogether. While unrealistic, deciding to keep a single light source at all times has some advantages to it, like the clean silhouette that keeps it more readable to the eye. So the developers might have just weighed all their options and thought that the best choice was to always have a light source, even when there's a wall in the way. Now, moving on, the next step is something I'm calling tunification, for lack of a better word, and what it does is clean up the vertex lighting generated in the first stage, turning it from this smooth, almost plasticky look into something that has that distinctive cel-shaded edge. And just to clear things up a bit, at this stage in the effect, the game actually hasn't applied the textures to Link's own model yet, so what we should be seeing is something that looks a little bit more like this. Just the vertex lighting on its own. And since you're probably wondering, Link's eyes and mouth never actually receive lighting in the game, they're always super bright, so I've just left them alone here. Now, to apply tunification, the game uses a texture, but doesn't quite use it in the way you might think. Deep in the game's files is a texture called ZA-Tune, which looks like this. The output generated from vertex lighting is one of 256 values between 0 and 255, and this ZA-Tune texture is 256 pixels wide. So what we can do is convert vertex lighting into something else using this texture. For example, a vertex lighting value of 58 can be converted by looking up into this texture with an x-coordinate of 58. The resulting grayscale color of ZA-Tune at that location is what the output of tunification will be. In this case, that results in pure black. We can then repeat the process with the remaining vertex lighting values across the entire model to get the entire output of tunification. Looking closer at this texture, we can see that all vertex lighting values less than about 120 will always output pure black, and anything greater than 136 results in pure white. And in between these two values, a sharp gradient exists in the middle, just to soften it out a bit. Now, this texture holds a lot of power. We could, if we wanted to, slide it around to play with a threshold for what is considered bright, or widen the gradients to smooth things out a bit, or even add multiple steps. But sometimes the very boring solution is just the most effective option, a small gradient right smack dab in the middle. What's far more interesting than this texture is the way it's used. Having the vertex lighting be the input to the texture is another great example of the power of textures, beyond simply placing them directly onto models. There is a decent amount of creativity to be had just in finding ways to place the textures themselves. For the final step, we need to add in the color palette from the scene. On paper, that's quite simple. Take the white half of Link and replace the white with a softer highlight color, and then take the black half and do the same for that as well. The complicated bit isn't the tech involved in replacing these colors, but instead, figuring out what colors to replace things with. Now, the obvious way to do this would be to just pick two colors, a brighter highlights tone that contains some warmth from the sun, and a slightly cooler one for the shadows. However, The Wind Waker is a game that has a day-night cycle, and our choice will soon stick out like a sore thumb as soon as the sun sets and the moon starts to rise into the sky. But that's an easy fix, we'll just pick two more colors for the nighttime as well. And that's starting to look pretty okay now, but then we encounter the issue that it will soon start raining. And boy howdy, that doesn't look right either. No worries, let's pick some more colors for when it rains. So now we have two colors for clear skies during the day, two colors for clear skies during the night, two colors for rainy weather during the night, and we forgot to pick the colors for rainy weather during the day, and already this is getting really complicated. So how would we solve this? Well, one way might be to use some basic rules to generate colors from the other ones. Like, maybe we start by picking just one color for the highlights. Then, we say that to get any shadow color, we take the associated highlight color and dim it down by 20%. To get the highlight color of the night, we'll start with the one for the day, desaturate it a bit, and then shift the hue a little bit to get some of the deeper ocean blue-greens. The other rule still applies, so the night shadow color is, again, the night highlight color dimmed down by 20%. And we could continue like this, using a large collection of rules to define all the rest of the colors. The advantage of this is that if we wanted to make all shadows darker, we would only have to adjust a few rules to do so, and everything would automatically update. The disadvantage is that if we wanted to individually tweak something, like brighten up the shadows a bit, but only during rainy nighttime, we lose that level of control. Now, in real life, all lighting around us uses these sorts of rules rather than hand-picked colors, and so most games follow suit, using techniques like this to decide all of their lighting. But in some cases, the colors it generates can be a bit boring. So the other option is to keep pushing on with our manual color palette. We'll define two colors for day, two colors for night, sunny, rainy, everything, keep going. There might be a lot of colors to wrangle, but wrangling lots of data in a giant open world is kind of the job description of a game developer in the first place. So the team for Wind Waker made color palettes not just for day and night, but for 6 different times of day, each one evoking a different feel. In addition to sunny skies and stormy weather, some islands in the game have an additional state, snow. And it's not just the characters that get these color palettes, there exists colors for the entirety of the lighting on the islands, the tinting of the ocean waves, the tones of the sky, even the windows that light up at night are all powered by this color palette system. Deep inside the game's files for the ocean is exactly this color palette I'm showing right now on screen. Every color carefully chosen by the art team. To be clear, it's not like a manual color palette is strictly better than the more automatic rule-based approach. Both are totally viable options with different pros and cons. Perhaps for the development team on The Wind Waker, the pros of the manual color palette, like the control it can give over the final aesthetic, were strong enough to outweigh the large amount of time and effort it would require from the development team. After all, one of the core guiding principles of the Wind Waker's art style is that it is almost exclusively based on strong hits of vibrant colors. But it's not like the team didn't sometimes use rule-based approaches too. You might have noticed earlier that when we were staring into the sun, the sky got brighter and the island got darker. That was done with a rule hard-coded into the game's engine that darkens the island's color palettes and brightens the skies, based on how much we're looking at the sun when in first person. And when sailing across the ocean through some stormy weather, lightning can occasionally strike, and along with it, another rule inside the game's code to replace every highlight and shadow with a gorgeous electrifying blue. These are two cases of the team occasionally choosing to add some extra rules instead of an entirely new palette. Perhaps they felt these worked well enough that they saw no need for the extra control and complexity that a full manual palette would bring. So the choice isn't necessarily between the manual palette or the rules, but simply being smart about when to use each of these two approaches. The programmers and artists on the team likely had to touch base quite frequently to make sure that each member had exactly as much control as necessary, but no more. And I think that this shows an interesting development style that gives a little bit of insight into how the teams at Nintendo really think about the art and craft of not only making games, but making games that stand the test of time. This coordinated approach to lighting and color was fairly unique at the time to the best of my knowledge, and I still haven't seen anything quite like it today. None of the 3 steps explored here today are, on their own, complicated ideas, but they require quite a lot of courage and vision to follow them all the way through to the end. Whether that means going for lights that shine through walls, or a simple toon texture instead of a more extravagant one, or wrangling a tremendous amount of color palettes. And keep in mind, this is all from one tiny effect in the game out of hundreds, if not thousands. There's no greater test of all this work than just showing the final lighting on its own. Even without Link's textures, it still just fits in a way that's hard to describe. Lighting in games is both subtle and complicated, but you can pretty quickly tell when something's gone wrong, and I think that shows how much of an impact it can have on a game's looks. There's no game quite like The Wind Waker, and its success is due to the team's collective imaginations as much as it is the technical execution. They have clearly put countless hours into nailing this aesthetic, but in a way, doing their job right means nobody will ever notice it took any time at all. Hey there, thank you for watching all the way to the end. I know it's been a few months since the last video, but as you might be able to tell, these things can take quite a while to make. I assure you I'm always working on more though. For my next video, I figured I'd take a bit of a break from some of these deeper dives, and instead, just relax and take some time to answer some of your questions. So if you have something you'd like me to answer, either about Wind Waker or Super Mario Galaxy, or really anything else you think I might be able to answer, feel free to leave it in the comments below, or ask me on Twitter at JasperRLZ, and I'll try to get to it in the next video. If you would like to explore some of these incredible landscapes for yourself, I run something called noclip.website, which lets you visit some of the worlds from the games like Wind Waker. The link, is down in the description. And if you find something really cool, and let me be honest, like people find really cool stuff in all these levels, definitely let me know. But also, come join the official noclip.website Discord, which I've also linked down there below. Oh, and special thanks goes to Will, Jewel, Jeremy, Mia, and Argle Bargle. Catch you all in the next one. Take care.